Welcome back and thanks for staying with us. It's certainly one of our big stories this Monday morning. President Cyril Ramaphosa has officially arrived in China. That's where he's expected to meet with his counterpart Xi Jinping before Wednesday's China-Africa Cooperation Forum. They're expected to announce important updates on trade and global politics, we're told. Still, of course, no telling what those might be. But let's make sense of the dynamics surrounding these engagements. Bring in now Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective. That's Ms. Lebohang Pheko, who joins us via our video link. And it's always great to have you on the SABC News channel. Thank you very much indeed for making time. You know, in the past, the kind of characterization of the relationship that Africa has with China has been one where the continent is seen to receive major investment projects in the form of, any kind of infrastructure development while trading off their market, right? So China selling off their goods to people in Africa. As we enter this particular iteration of the summit, to what extent do you reckon that relationship has changed?
If at all. So, you raised some good questions because there are a few things that have been happening over the last 12 to 18 months in China's economy, which may actually impact on its own relationships and bilateral and multilateral relationships economically, globally, and specifically on the Africa continent. And there's been rumors of a slowdown. In fact, they're not rumors. The Chinese economy has slowed down relative to the vigorousness that we've seen in previous years, although, of course, it's still a formidable economic force. And what this has meant, of course, is that they are pulling back slightly on their own international expenditure and on their own economic finance ambitions. And it also comes at a time when the underpinnings of what these relationships mean are also shifting. So the one being trade, of course, another one being investments, the other one being fiscal stability, another one being, of course, the RMB, the currency of the RMB. And the last, which is quite important for your question, is people-to-people relationships. And that's incredibly fuzzy, but it speaks to what you're talking about, which speaks to the idea that it cannot be a one-way and a sort of a sense in which China sets the terms of engagements entirely without understanding that the Africa continent is more than just a playground, a place to just bring industry, to bring even their own personnel, and sometimes seem almost like a pseudo-colonial power themselves, but that, of course, they need many African resources in order to fuel their own investment aspirations locally and their own domestic poverty eradication ambitions, as well as their own ambitions to be a global power, which they have certainly become. And this whole idea of what soft power means negates the idea that you can just be an overwhelming unilateral party, but that you must act in concert with these partners that you aspire to be in relationship with.
Absolutely. And, there's always that concern, especially among skeptics, that this is, the ongoing scramble for Africa. And, we need to be circumspect about what we concede to and ultimately what we don't if we're going to see through the interests of the continent. Is it easy, though, to draw those lines of demarcation, given just how murky global politics has become? We know that the West in and of itself is going through incredible change. And South Africa, for one, on the continent, has always been quite open and frank that they enter all these discussions with South African interests in mind, no matter who they're speaking to.
Oh, so, I think quite significantly, the South African continent's geopolitical significance has become very important. And in fact, our growth as a aggregated growth across different economies on the continent is matching the growth that China has seen, the economy has seen in recent years, in the last couple of decades. And indeed, it's clear that our geopolitical importance is quite significant through the other bilateral agreements and the other circling around by different partners and prospective partners that have been taking place over the last year or two. Turkey has been circling around. Italy have got their Mate plan with 9 key hydrogen producing countries, mainly across West Africa. Kenya is also a signatory to that. So certainly, the Africa region as a flavor is important, but I think that it has become explicit. As one well-known diplomat said, we need Africa. Africa is the future. Without Africa, we cannot develop. And it's not said any more crassly, perhaps, and more explicitly than that. But also that to say that they are trying, of course, to also reshape their own relationships with different parts of the world and understanding that the BRICS formation is also now made up of very, very important, significant players as well. And in its expanded sense, in its expanding form, rapidly expanding form, there's not only does it create a competitive opportunity for many African countries, South Africa significantly, it also means that that we have more of a opportunity to be circumspect ourselves about who we want to relate to and how we want to relate to them.
Yeah, domestic politics always feature with these multilateral discussions. And my goodness, we've certainly had quite a few changes here at home, which I find are going to be so interesting to watch, especially insofar as the dynamics are concerned. And part of why I'm saying this is because we know that, for example, the DA has always had choice words for an ANC-led government, especially when it comes to its posture towards China. And as irony would have it, the DA's own leader, John Steenhuisen, is now part of this delegation. Of course, he's there as the agriculture minister, but he's going to have to, kind of negotiate a few things, because at the very least, we want South Africa to have a unified voice on this global stage. How do you see all of that unfolding?
Yeah, and you raise a very important question around, excuse me, how the GNU and the GNU as they call it, and this new coalition government, how it steers and how it pushes international relations forward. Yeah, what does this mean in the context of the fact that there are very deep differences amongst many of the parties, and as you say, the DA, the ANC have very different history. So of course the ANC has historic relationships both with Russia and with China, which come from a solidarity time of liberation politics as well. Whereas the DA has slightly more Zionist underpinnings, as we have seen in the conflict between Palestine and the aggression of Israel upon Palestine and the Gaza Strip. And I think what is going to be necessary here is to see, it's going to test the GNU's own elasticity in terms of how you present a united front internationally whilst having deep disagreements and fissures on the local front. And this is a sign of a test of the GNU's maturity, and also whether there's a difference between how GNU presents itself outward facing versus when we are scrabbling around talking about load shedding and mayorships right here within the country.
Yeah, absolutely. One wonders how many tongues will be bitten as those discussions continue, but we'll see what the final announcement is. I'm fascinated by this concept of soft power and the fact that, all of that kind of thinking is always top of mind for people who are watching from the outside. The president started by making, by alluding to how our democracy is evolving here at home, and he reckons, their foreign policy is still very much around ensuring that there's global peace, et cetera, et cetera. But what's not lost to a lot of people watching is that this is still a democratic country entering these kind of discussions with a nation whose human rights records is always, let's say, left a lot to be desired, some people might say. It almost seems to me that that issue, around that soft influence doesn't necessarily feature in these discussions, and I wonder if it should.
Well, to be completely cynical with you, I'm not sure whether rights records have been the underpinning and the cornerstone of most international economic arrangements. If so, I think that, a country like the United States would not feature very well. They would not come out shining, cleansed in glory, polished in goodness at all, given their own, firstly, they have support for several, the regime change and the extrajudicial killings of several heads of state, Muammar Gaddafi being just one example of that. So I think that it becomes tricky if we say human rights, because there's the international double standards that are often at play in these scenarios. And I think that we have seen that across places like DRC, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Libya, and so on, that where they are corporate interests and where they are, where capital and corporations and multinationals can make a quick buck, they will almost always do so, rather than be having any real concern with governance and human rights niceties in any of those countries. So there's often this whole I think I find that there's this dichotomy between the outward posturing by day versus the actual what happens with the machinations of capital by night. It took how many years, in fact, for the world to respond to the settler colonial apartheid question right here in South Africa? It took years and years of sanctions. It took how much bloodshed before the human rights, the human dignity, and the settler question in this country captured the attention of the international community. So unfortunately, it is not always a given that, in fact, these sorts of issues are at the foreground of everybody's consideration when they're thinking around how to make, bilateral arrangements and how they're trying to make a quick economic buck, which is going to place their own country's interests at the forefront.
Fascinating take. And as we're speaking, we're watching continuous photo op moments, I suppose. Several of our ministers with their counterparts from China seemingly gathering at the table in frame there. It looks like they're signing something, but not convincingly so. And I suppose the real nexus question becomes, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, what this means for ordinary South Africans, especially off the back of these huge macro questions that we often debate. You know, the man on the street who is now saddled with incredibly crippling cost of living rates. Hopefully the repo rate does go down. But from your perspective, do these things ever result in the material change of ordinary people, perhaps both in China and South Africa?
I mean, for example, I'm just looking at some statistics here. The consumption of crude oil, for example, from that China is buying and consuming from the Africa region has dipped quite significantly. And the only country that's seen on the continent now that's seen an increase is Chad, which has seen an increase of about 78%. Countries like Sudan, South Sudan, Nigeria, they've all seen declines in the oil consumption from China. South Africa as well has not also been exempt from this. So, for example, Namibia in their beef exports, South Africa also in our beef exports, in our gold exports as well, have also seen a dip somewhat. A lot of the infrastructure that was built by China in South Africa has been underutilized since it was constructed for different reasons. COVID was one part of that. And of course, another part of that is our own internal priorities, which have been very much rebuilding our economy, our own internal skirmishes. And sometimes, of course, yes, it has to be said, our own internal policy inconsistencies as well. Remember also that China is going through its own interesting internal politics, which are going to impact on how they look outward to the world. So the Chinese Communist Party themselves have also rethought of their own bilateral agreements, have also reframed, because internally they are looking to try to build the job market for Chinese citizens, especially because their own economy is shrinking somewhat. That is bound to hamper the level of productivity and the level of market activity within their own market. So what does this mean? It means that they're not going to be looking as outwardly to South Africa, to the Africa continent. And what does this mean for the person on the street? Hardly anything, Ayanda. I mean, it hardly ever translates, unfortunately. These sort of bilateral investment agreements, they take years and decades for them to translate into something that is meaningful for, Cebu and Tembi on the street. And often at times because sometimes they are reframed and reconstructed by different incoming and outgoing governments. Incoming and outgoing even ministers often drop the ball and leave those agreements askew. So because we don't always follow these things consistently and follow through, they themselves are also going through their own internal issues. I don't think that Cebu and Tembi on the street per se. It would take ideally decades, maybe a generation, for these sorts of agreements to begin to bear fruit in terms of bringing skills that are necessary, building the social and skills infrastructure that are necessary, and beginning to take a dent on the economy. Which is why I think that we should always be careful not to over rely on external foreign direct investment for our own personal and national growth, because when their own domestic regimes go through changes, we become deprioritized oftentimes.
Absolutely. Always fascinating to hear your thoughts on these issues. Ms. Lebohang Pheko, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. We'll certainly keep watching the situation as it unfolds in Beijing and hopefully continue to make sense of it all. Ms. Lebohang Pheko is a Senior Research Fellow with the Trade Collective. Once again, thanks very much indeed.